Welcome to the Bible Theology blog. My name is Seth Knorr, and I'm glad you're here. Today we're going to be talking about Phoebe, and in Romans 16, 1 through 2, we're going to answer the question, does Paul say that Phoebe is a deacon? But more importantly, based on the information in the verse, is Phoebe also an elder? And I believe the answer to both of those questions, you will find the answer is yes. So in my book, A Biblical Case for Women Pastors, Elders, and Deacons, which is on sale now, I have more detailed information and all of the reference points for this video. Feel free to get that. Now, in my book, I give this as the translation for that passage of Romans 16, 1 through 2. I give a recommendation to you for our sister Phoebe, who is currently the deacon, which is diakonos, of the church in Centria. In order that you receive her with open arms in the Lord in a way which is worthy of the saints, give assistance to her in whatever task she may need you for. She has been, which is ginomai, which is aorist indicative, a leader, which is prostatus, of many, and in fact, she was even my leader at one time. Now, understanding the Greek of this passage, it really does make clear that Phoebe was both an elder and a deacon based on the Greek nouns diakonos and the other noun prostatos. And diakonos is the same noun, Greek noun, used in 1 Timothy 3:8 when Paul outlined the leadership position specifically for deacons. And that's where it's really just a transliteration of that Greek term. Now, if I wanted to call somebody in first century AD a deacon as a position of a specific church, there wasn't really any more explicit of a way to call someone that than the words that Paul used. And starting off with the part where he calls her a diakonos. And give you an example in English. If I were to say, call somebody a pastor of a church in Orlando, are you going to say, no, that person isn't actually a pastor? No, that would be absurd because there's no way that you can say it more explicitly than that way. And in Greek, it's kind of the same way. In the English, the pastor of is, what you would see in the genitive case. It shows possession, and it puts them in a particular group, which I'll talk about a little bit more. And really, the only way you would argue that somebody wasn't a pastor in Orlando, if I said that, was basically based on bias. Like, there's no other way somebody would claim otherwise. But you also have this same kind of Greek construction that you see in Romans 16:1. Also in Acts 20:17, just to give you an example. It says in Acts 20:17, from Miletus he, which was Paul, sent a message to Ephesus telling the elders of the church to come to him. Now, church there is tes ecclesias, which is genitive, and that's preceded by tous presbyterus, which is accusative. And so it's the same kind of Greek construction where an accusative is followed by a genitive. Genitive shows possession. And basically he's explicitly saying these are elders that are in the church. He's not saying these are just like some old people or, elders that are somewhere else that aren't church elders. Like, that would be absurd to make that kind of argument. And no one is, because it would be absurd, right? The only reason why people are saying that Phoebe was not a deacon is because they believe that women should not be deacons. And that's really biased. And unfortunately, when you make arguments and base your theology based off of the conclusion first and then go to the evidence, you're going to come up with whatever translation you want to come up with. It's really the backwards way to do it. In fact, actually, what's interesting is if you go to Romans 16, where we talk about Junia as an apostle, it's funny because in that respect, it talks about Junia being among the apostles, and it's N plus a dative, and so there's these big papers and big discussions that have been made on that, and they basically say, look, if they were saying that Junia was an apostle, they would have used the genitive case to make that point, and then it would have been extremely clear. Okay, but it's ironic because they make that point there, but then when you go back to Phoebe, they're like, yeah, but she wasn't a deacon either, even though they used the genitive. And to me, that's just intellectually dishonest. And you're really pulling what I like to say, pulling the Greek over someone's eyes. I heard that from another YouTuber, and I love it, and that's a great way to put it. And you're basically deceiving people that don't know Greek, and making arguments one way for one thing and another way for another thing, and not really following a specific methodology in your interpretation. But there is a lot of evidence. Actually, Kenneth Bailey was a lecturer in the Middle Eastern New Testament studies as a professor of New Testament at the Neri School of Theology in Beirut. He comments on Romans 16:2 that a 9th century Arabic version translated this phrase in Romans 16:2 as in authority over many and over myself as well. And we're going to talk about that as well, because that is one argument that complementarians will make, as they'll say, well, Paul had no one over him. And I would agree with that. Paul, at the end of his ministry, did not have anyone over him. He was definitely at the top of the pecking order. But that was not always the case. He did not become a Christian and day one accede to the top of the church. No, he was actually at the bottom for quite a bit, and he would have followed the leadership rules just like anybody else if you go into a church. Just like when I was younger, I'm an elder now in my church, but I did not, I was not an elder when I was born. No, it took time. It took time of me going to the current church that I am at now, serving in that church, and going to previous churches, the churches that I grew up in. There's other evidence though too. There was actually an early church father named Origen, and he was not pro-woman at all. In fact, he is actually one of the reasons why women don't have leadership positions, and they were kind of devalued. But even he understands that you can't say that she was not a deacon. In fact, in his commentary on Romans 16, he says, this text teaches with the authority of the apostle that even women are instituted deacons in the church. This is the function which was exercised in the church of Centria by Phoebe. So he obviously knew, look, I can't argue against the Greek here. It's pretty clear. Biblical scholar William Tyndale, who was the first to translate the Greek into English, in his translation of the Bible, in Romans 16:1, he actually calls Phoebe a minister of the congregation of Centria. There's also a gravestone inscription that's found at the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. And the inscription is very interesting. If we translate it into English, it says, "Here lies Sophia, the servant bride of Christ, the deacon," which is diakonos, "the second Phoebe." And here's the thing. If Phoebe wasn't a deacon or seen as a deacon, this inscription makes zero sense at all. Like, why would you be claiming to be a second Phoebe if she was just, had no role at all in the church, was not a leader, wasn't seen as a leader. It's pretty clear here that people in the early church saw Phoebe as holding the position of deacon. Now, the question is, okay, she's a deacon, and some people will play that off and say, well, deacons had no authority. Okay. Here's one little side note to note, is that every single leader in the church, no one writer ever calls anybody an elder by name, ever, in the New Testament. So, for instance, Paul never said, hey, me, Elder John, or Elder so-and-so. Now, occasionally, someone does call themselves an elder, like Peter called himself an elder. I believe, actually, Paul called himself an elder with the noun, not the adjective, which is generally how somebody would say they were an elder or call somebody an elder. So that is the case. However, Paul never used it. Instead, he always used doulos, which is servant or slave, or diakonos, which were actually synonymous terms that were used interchangeably. In fact, when Paul was using those words, he was really referencing Jesus when he said, if you want to be great, you have to first be a servant or slave. And Jesus also is quoted as using those terms interchangeably in the Gospels. At least that's how it was written in the Gospels. So the terms obviously were interchangeable. So really, whenever you see servant or slave, you could replace that with deacon if the context is right. Because like I said, deacon is just a transliteration of the term. But let's see what the question is. What does prostatus mean? And it's interesting. I really never believed in bias, and because there's some people that really throw out, hey, everything's biased. I'm not. I'm like, you got to be careful there, because once you learn Greek and really know Greek, there's reasons why people translate things a certain way. And there might be some little biases here and there, but for the most part, they try to follow standard rules of translation. That is not the case here. I found very shocking that the BDAG lexicon, which is very well respected lexicon, the entries in BDAG, extremely biased. As the definitions, they have protectress, patroness, and helper. And those definitions are, protectress is the only definition that is clearly accurate. Prostatus is somebody that protects people. But generally, it was actually always a leader that protects. In fact, every time that word was used, it was always somebody in high authority. For instance, it was used very often in Greek mythology of Greek gods, false gods, like Athena, who was seen as a protectress of the city, or a protectress in war, and she was a warrior. But every time it was somebody with a high level of authority that it was used in reference to. And you think about that, why would Paul use that term? Well, what is a pastor? There's somebody that protects the flock. And I kind of go a little bit further in depth in that in my book. So that is one meaning, but the second meaning is leader, and it definitely means leader. BDAG completely ignored all of the references they gave in their own lexicon and just did not reference them, and came up with a completely biased entry. So for instance, to show that BDAG is being biased, let me give you a couple of examples that are unbiased because they were translated by people that were just translating a specific period Koine Greek work, which the Koine period was anything from 330 BC to 330 AD is essentially what it's defined as. So that would be the literature that would kind of work in that time period that you would get the lexical range of the word prostatus. So Ernest Carey, he was a professor at Princeton. He translated prostatus as leader in Cassius Dia's Roman history. They declared her queen and proceeded to persecute the war more vigorously, inasmuch as they now had as leader Prestatus, a representative of the family of the Ptolemies. There it is clear. Okay, it's referring to a queen, and it's called. She is called a Prestatus. Definitely a leader, and that was in a early, I think it was 2nd century work, AD. Another example we have is from Eusebius and Atticus. Eusebius actually quotes Atticus. Atticus was a 2nd century Greek philosopher who spoke of Plato, and in his work he states in 15.9, he states, "But the more Plato tried to magnify the importance of the soul, declaring it the beginning of creation and the pupil of God, and the power, Prostatus, presiding over all things, so much the more contentiously did Aristotle seek to destroy and to dishonor and prove the soul to be almost nothing." So there, Prostatus is used in reference to a power that's so great it presides over all things. That means it's not just the high power, but the greatest power. And this is what I've been saying. Every time that the word is used, it's always in reference to the highest level of leadership. It's not just like a, Joe Sunday leader who might be, the leader of, say, parking cars. It's somebody, as in a leader of the highest leader, like they ruled a country or were a Greek false god, something to that effect. I think this clearly proves. But there's more. Prostatus definitely applies there, but also it was used as a synonym for dunamis, which in the New Testament, dunamis shows such high power that it was actually sometimes translated as miracles. Okay, so it was used as a synonym by a Greek philosopher on the cave of the nymphs in the 13th book of the Odyssey. It was translated by Thomas Taylor, who was an ancient Greek philosopher. And the section below uses Prostatus as a synonym for dunamis. And it says, "To the nymphs, likewise, who preside over Prostatus, waters." So, once again, they're the highest power over the waters. "A cavern in which there are perpetually flowing streams is adapted. Let therefore this present cavern be consecrated to souls, and among the more partial powers, dunamis, 2 nymphs that preside over streams and fountains." Okay, but this is not the only time Prostatus is used as a synonym for dunamis. We're going to go over that, but it is clear from these that Prostatus basically can mean preside over, have power over. There's actually another passage that is 8:6, and further down it says, "For we peculiarly call the naiads and the powers, dunamis, that preside over the water, nymphs." Okay, so in that same work, he once again uses dunamis in the same manner as he previously used Prostatus. So he used the words interchangeably. But ironically, that is not the only place where that occurs. There's also another work. It's Vitae et Miracula Mirae. This dates back to the 1st century AD, pertains to Christ. Just before the passage given, it's about having beheld the resurrection of Christ. And then the passage begins speaking of Christ's return, which I translated as, "Those who see it happen will tremble with fear, try to escape, but he will come forth, and in an instant the stars will fall as a sign from above down to the earth. and with power, which is prostatus, and the gates of the church will be opened, and he will be found. Now, the earth there is oikonomia, which I believe was actually a textual variant. Oikonomia would be a household manager. I think that's a scribal error. I think it was supposed to be oika mene, which would be earth. Household manager doesn't really make sense there. So kind of when you change that and realize that, then the passage makes sense. So in Bible prophecy, in the New Testament, we see dunamis, the dunamis power of his coming and the dunamis power of the heavens. For instance, Luke 21:26-27 in the Net Bible, it says, "For the powers, dunamis of the heavens will be shaken, and then they will see the Son of Man arriving in a cloud with power, dunamis, and glory." So that's Luke 21:26-27, but also the same passage in Mark 13:26 and Matthew 24:29-30. So another interesting figure that we have that will play into this meaning is we have to talk about Enyo a little bit. Enyo is also another Greek god in Greek mythology, a false god. She's described in the Dictionary of Greek and Roman Biography and Mythology as someone who is described as bloodthirsty, and you can hardly assign that as somebody who is a protectress, somebody that is bloodthirsty. Anyway, in the description of Greece, it says, which was written 110 to 180 AD, was when Pausanias lived, and it says, "He, Homer, said nothing further about this goddess, being the mightiest of gods in human affairs and displaying great strength, as in the Iliad. He represented Athena and Enyo as supreme in war," which there he uses hegemonia. It's the Greek hegemonia is specifically, but we call it hegemony. Okay, that's where we get the word hegemony from. Basically, it kind of retains the similar meaning that we use it today. The LSG lexicon defines hegemonia as leading the way, going first, authority rule, presidency, political supremacy, political leadership, governorship. Okay, hegemonia is used the exact same sense as prostatus in regard to Enyo being called supreme in war. In the 1st century BC, Enyo is described in the same way. It says, Enyoleus, from the goddess Enyo, she is supreme in war, and their supreme is prostatus. So it's used as a synonym for what we would describe as hegemony, okay, the ultimate power. Another example of prostatus meaning president is there's an inscription at the base of a granite statue found in Alexandria, Egypt, dating to the early 1st century AD, which was translated by John S. Kloppenborg, a professor at the University of Toronto, and is an expert in Greco-Roman culture. And the translation is as such: the high priestess and president Prostatus Teteris dedicated this to the Apollyon Women's Synod in and we can't read the year, of Caesar on the 1st of the month of Pacan. Okay, so there it means president. Okay. And then we have Irene of Athens, who was the empress of the Byzantine Empire, ruling from 797 to 802 AD. An inscription honoring her calls her a prostatus. So once again, something that is very interesting, shows that it is defined as a leadership position. Now, Going back to, I think we clearly have shown that prostatus means somebody in a high level of leadership. Okay, I've never seen, a lot of times scholars, even egalitarian scholars will say that Phoebe was somebody that gave money, so she was like a patroness. Okay, the first issue is if that meant patron or patroness. A patron was somebody that was in a level of leadership. Actually, in Greek times, there in the first century, you would actually have to vote for them as a political candidate. You'd have to salute them in the morning. It's not like we think of patron today. Like, they actually had a high level of standing in society as a leader, and generally they were considered, for instance, as like a leader of an entire city. So even then, okay, it was still meaning leader, but I've yet to find a single example in Greek where prostatus clearly meant somebody that was in the patron role. Like, it meant patron. Yes, it meant somebody that was a leader, and they would use that in a context where somebody was a patron. But generally, actually, that was the masculine noun in that regard. But getting back to this, the argument, okay, if Phoebe was a deacon and it's saying she was an elder and she was over many people and over myself being Paul, that means that Paul had her as a leader. Could that be possible? Well, let me give you an example. If I was to say that Tom McKenzie was an amazing coach over many football players, including Tom Brady, you might be like, what do you mean? Tom McKenzie was never a coach in the NFL. Like, why would you say that? Like, he obviously was not Tom Brady's coach. We know who Tom Brady's coaches were. And I would be like, well, I wasn't talking about Tom Brady when he was in the NFL, because it's not like Tom Brady was born and ended up in the NFL. No, he played football throughout the years. He played high school football, and Tom McKenzie was his high school coach. And the key, going back to the passage in Romans 16, 1 through 2, is their genomai, which is specifically a gen athe, is aorist indicative, which means Phoebe would not currently have been a prostatus over Paul, but was at one time, because it's aorist is past tense, essentially, and indicative is the mood of fact. So it's saying, factually speaking, Phoebe was a leader over Paul. So she, I think it's pretty clear from these examples, she definitely held the high position in the church as someone who was both a deacon and an elder, which one of the things I believe we get wrong in church today is we think of them as separate positions. In my opinion, and based on my studies, I think in the New Testament, every leader was a deacon. But if you ascended higher, you were also a deacon and an elder. An elder, I think, probably was more of a reference to the age of the person and the leadership. I kind of go into that a little bit in the book. A lot of times in early Christianity, they put an age, even for being a deacon, of like 40. Sometimes I think there was also maybe an age for elders of possibly 60, possibly 40. It's kind of hard to say where we get that. So going back to the benefactor part, there's only one time where there's evidence for that, and BDAG references the history of the Jewish people in the time of Jesus Christ by German theologian and historian Emil Schur. And page 102 of the book states, for the patron, the Greek term prostates also occurs. And in the footnote, Schur references an inscription mentioned earlier in his book on a marble block that probably functioned as a door jamb. He states, contains the names and functions of persons who contributed for the foundation of something, presumably a building. From the names which follow include a female patroness, prostates, named Ayel, and her son Iasu as archon, Samuel as a presbytes and priest, Benjamin as a psalmologus, three persons described as proselytas, variously abbreviated with the names Samuel, Iasses, and Iaseph, son of Eusebius, and two persons described as Theosebes. This statement by Schur is really pure speculation. What's interesting is a couple things. First off, if IL is a woman and not a man, which that is debated, it doesn't really make sense, because the only way that you can use prostatus and prostates as interchangeable and having the same meaning is if the nouns meant the same and one applied to a man and one applied to a woman, which is definitely the case. However, if you have any crossover at all, like where the masculine is being applied to a woman, that makes no sense, and therefore the words have completely different meaning. This cannot in any way affect the meaning of prostatus as meaning patron, because if it was a woman, it can't be that. The other thing that I find interesting is we have all these other titles. Yeah, BDAG never says, oh, well, then that means that Samolagus is a patron. No, because that's not how language works. Just because I give money to church doesn't automatically mean that my name Seth means patron. That's just insane. Okay, and so you have titles of numerous. So you also have presbytes. Do we say presbytes, which is elder, which is actually there a noun? Do we say that means a patron? No. Okay. So one of the claims that the BDAG lexicon makes is that prostatus was used as a technical term with a technical meaning of benefactor. The thing is if you're going to say that prostatus has a technical meaning, which words in the Bible are argued sometimes that they have a technical meaning in the Bible that is different than words outside the Bible, the only way that you get there is if you have a monumental amount of evidence where you just have instance after instance in a particular work or a particular field that shows that that's what that word means, and every time you see it, that's how it's translated. That's the only way you can get a technical meaning. It's very arbitrary, though, what BDAG is saying, because they don't give in any instances of the actual word prostatus meaning benefactor. The only example they gave was prostates, which is the masculine noun cognate of prostatus, which is a feminine noun. And so, yes, they can have the same meaning, but even the example given as we explained doesn't even clearly show that even prostates meant benefactor. So how can you claim it has a technical meaning if you don't have the examples to back it up? Quite frankly, this clearly shows that BDAG was very biased in their translations and their glosses, because if they had done the background work and looked at other translations like I did, that other people did, they weren't done by me. I did like one of the translations in the examples I gave, okay? All the other ones were done by professional translators who had no skin in the game. They weren't trying to prove anything. They were just translating a work the best that they knew how based on their knowledge of Greek. And they came to the conclusion in those specific instances based on context and what they know about the specific work, which is very important, that prostatus meant leader, or a leader who protects, or dunamis power, very powerful, with synonymous terms such as that. So if you want a fuller discussion on this topic, what you can do is get a copy of my new book. It is A Biblical Case for Women Pastors, Elders, and Deacons. And you can also help out. Subscribe to my YouTube channel. I will be doing videos on a multitude of topics. One is such as this, with women in ministry. I'll continue to do videos in that regard. Hit the subscribe, get notified every time I have a new video coming out, and hope to see you on the next video.